We come to South Africa now, where its economy will likely contract this year by more than 7%. It was previously forecast by Treasury. However, it will now contract more than 7%. And GDP has shrunk by a record 51% in second quarter on quarter-on-quarter numbers, its fourth quarterly contraction in a row. As a strict lockdown to curb spread of coronavirus, it has seen activity grind to a near standstill. The contraction in growth is larger than expected by National Treasury and South African Reserve Bank, which raises risk that actual GDP outcome for this year could be lower than previously thought by both policymakers and broader market. In July, our Reserve Bank cut its 2020 forecast for GDP to 7.3% contraction. The country is looking to speed up reforms by easing regulatory hurdles and allowing more private investment in public sector, especially in electricity. With debt of around 500 billion rand or $30 billion, South African economy is heavily reliant on bailouts from government. Uma, she's head of School of Economics and Finance, University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Good morning to you. First of all, we would like to know your thoughts on contraction of economy in South Africa.
I think there is an important clarification required here. When we say negative 50%, that's slightly misleading. So what really Stats SA brought out yesterday was the growth between the first quarter GDP and second quarter GDP, which was negative 16.4%. Now, using these figures, one can annualize it to garner an annual growth rate. And that's how the negative 51% was reached. It is a routine practice to annualize the GDP growth figures using quarterly growth rates. However, it has to be done on a normal course. Now, as everybody understands, world over, this has not been a normal quarter by any measure for any country. Therefore, using this particular quarter, which is highly unusual, highly unprecedented, and not likely to repeat for the subsequent quarters of 2020, it would not be appropriate to extrapolate this number to say that South African economy has declined by 51%. So this needs to be clarified, and the expected decline, nobody is saying South African economy is performing well by any measure, but the economy is not also doing worse than what other economies world over are doing. So the expected annual decline, one would say, would range from negative 9% to about 12%. So that's the expectation. So using this particular quarter to derive the annualized figure and come up with big headlines of negative 51% decline is highly misleading. And this needs to be clarified very clearly.
And what are the big economic challenges before the economy of South Africa?
What one needs to remember about South African economy was pre-COVID, when everything changed for all the countries in the world, South Africa was already on a technical recession. So 2019, the 4 quarters, except for the second quarter, the 3 quarters had negative GDP growth rates in 2019 already, which means that South Africa was already in a technical recession prior to COVID. And then when COVID happened, obviously bad things got worse. So it's going to be a long recovery for South Africa, and not necessarily simply from the fallout of the COVID implications, but the bigger challenges that South Africa faces relates to structural issues. These are deep-rooted in the economy, deep-rooted in the politics and society of the country that would need to be addressed, and simply recovering from COVID and the discovery of a vaccination is not going to solve South African economy's problems. So it's going to be a long, tough journey ahead for South Africa. COVID has simply just fastened, accelerated the decline, but it was already on a steep slope, unfortunately.
Can you tell us, according to you, what big steps the South African government has taken so far?
So the steps that South African government has taken has really been to address the fallout of COVID and the shutdown and the lockdown of the economy. And South African government has to be applauded for putting in place fiscal interventions in terms of giving social grants, increasing the payouts and welfare transfers to the most vulnerable and poor of the society. But these are temporary measures, and even if it were to be sustained post-COVID in the years to come, the question of sustainability of these kind of fiscal interventions on South African budget is a big question. So what is required in the long run is very different from the measures that have been taken. And when I say in the long run, you're talking about structural reform, addressing the corruption in the country, liberalization, all of these steps which probably Indian viewers would remember in the 1991 reforms that India went through, following the IMF bailout, etc., would be some of the lessons that South African government can also learn from going forward. But this obviously requires strong political will, and of course a situation where the country is really left with no choice, and with the intervention of some of the multilateral organizations that bail out the country but also come with their own conditionalities.
So the last question to you would be, how do you rate South Africa's handling of COVID-19 crisis so far?
I must give that to the government. South African government has done much better and has been more proactive than many of, forget the developing country governments, but also the developed country governments. So South African government took the initiative of going into a complete nationwide lockdown quite early in the pandemic. It did not wait for things to get bad and worse before initiating these steps. So by the end of March, we had already gone into stage 5 lockdown, which is complete lockdown, wherein the government used the time of over a month to put in place additional health facilities, testing facilities, provide fiscal interventions to the needy. All of these were taken, and then in a calibrated manner, it opened up the economy slowly. Starting from May 1st, we moved to lockdown stage 3 to 4, and then subsequently in June to stage 3, and in August now to stage 2. And I think the government has been quite proactive. Studies have been done to see how people have responded, changed their behavior. And the message coming through is that government has been quite effective in inducing behavioral response in terms of physical distancing, in terms of mask wearing. And I think that must be handed to the government in terms of getting the message across and implementing it quite